It's a real honor, privilege for me to be here to share some of our stories of what we've been doing over the last 25 years that I've been on this journey. But before I get into some of the cases, maybe just a brief introduction to the Transformational Business Network. We describe ourselves as a network of disillusioned philanthropists and repentant bankers, repentant lawyers, repentant management consultants who want to use the gifts and their resources in a more impactful way, apart from just making money for people who already have a lot of money. So the reason I got into this was simply because of some of the data that I'd seen. And this is one of the earliest pieces of data. The red shows the amount of aid that has gone into sub-Saharan Africa over a 30-year period. And the blue is the impact that it had negatively on the GDP of these countries. It's almost as if the more aid, the more charity that we've given to sub-Saharan Africa, the more we've hurt their GDP. A bit more complicated than that, but we can obviously discuss that if you would like. And then the other piece of data that I saw that troubled me was this. So on the left panel, on my left, is the kind of typical kind of curve showing most developed nations have small numbers of micro enterprises with a very big number of small, medium-sized enterprises, and then a smaller number of multinational large institutions. Whereas in the developing emerging countries, what you have is a very big peak of micro enterprises, very little in the small SME space, and then you have a blip of multinationals. And if we are really serious about helping economies transform themselves and change and improve and grow, we've got to try and shift the kind of profile of the economy. And what is really missing is what the economists call the missing middle. In many of our emerging countries, it's easy to borrow money at the $100 to $1,000 through microfinance institutions. And then if you're politically connected, you can borrow $10 million without any problem. But try and borrow $500,000 to $2 million to $3 million to scale and grow your businesses. That's really, really difficult. And so that's the gap we're trying to plug through the TBN network. So we are a network of volunteers, largely volunteers. We have very few full-time people. We're just trying to arm twist talented business people, business professionals to go and do more about the kind of situation of inequality, of injustice, of poverty, of environmental degradation in their countries. And that's where we are now operating. This is a sample of some of the kind of funds that have emerged over the last 25 years of note. And we started out with people just being able to invest $10,000, $20,000 personally, individually, and then we clubbed together to do up to $250,000 together. And now we have funds that can do anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million per deal. And now we have funds that can do up to $15 million per deal. And these are some of the funds that are now in the network. Because the biggest problem for growing these kinds of businesses is that they run out of cash. Right? They are undercapitalized. We don't give them enough funding to really grow to profitability, and they just run out of cash. And so we wanted to create an ecosystem so that there will always be someone there to sort of do the next stage of funding. Our biggest investors now in these funds are the sovereign wealth funds. So it's Norfund, it's FMO, it's Proparco, it's the British government, because we've gone to them to say that carry on doing your aid, but the trouble with aid is that these governments keep coming back and asking for more aid the next time. Whereas if you make these kinds of investments, we start to see sustainable growth businesses that can create real jobs, that can then create real change in their own countries. A new fund, particularly I want to highlight, is a fund called N-Wealth. This has just been approved by the Kenyan authorities. We have been able to persuade now the pension funds of Kenya to allocate 1% of their asset under management into this kind of SME fund. Really exciting because you know pensions are very conservative, right? And in Kenya, most of the pension money goes to buying government bonds because they can get up to 16% per annum buying government bonds. So there's no incentive at all to lend to small, medium-sized enterprises. But we've challenged them to allocate just 1% of their asset under management because 1% is not going to make any difference to their overall fund performance. But that 1% in terms of capital could be a massive difference to the small, medium-sized enterprises in the country. So part of what TBN does is to catalyze more funds. We need more and more capital in this sector. We need to challenge people who are managing funds at the moment to maybe think about running these kinds of social impact funds. Another fund we're starting is with a very, very large private equity firm in Asia. After years of coming along to TBN conferences, the partners have finally agreed, yes, we will now start a social impact fund together with TBN. So we need more capital. And these are some of our investors now. So it's institutions, it's corporates. JP Morgan Social Finance was a major early investor with us. And then family offices, growing number of family offices investing in these kinds of funds. And these are some of the partners of which we really value UFM partnership with us. And Gaio, thank you so much for welcoming us, and we really, really appreciate this. But in Indonesia, the partnership is with the largest Islamic university, UIM. And in Singapore, the Singapore Management University is another big, important partner. And in Malaysia, this is with the Asia School of Business, which is an MIT joint venture with the Central Bank of Malaysia. So we're trying to catalyze more and more people to think about a different way to make these kinds of investments. In terms of sectors, we intentionally build businesses to tackle social problems. So I'll highlight some of these in a minute. So we are sector neutral. We just back a local entrepreneur to get them enough capital so they can grow their businesses to scale and have impact. It doesn't matter what sector. So we have businesses that deal with the problem of homelessness, that deal with the problem of human trafficking, to deal with the problem of reoffending. In the UK, 60% will reoffend after they leave prison within 2 years. So prisons are not good places to help people change and transform. And so how do we use an enterprise approach rather than the traditional aid and charity? So many different sectors are represented now within the TBN network in terms of the sectors. And then maybe just a few words about the kind of financing that we do. Now, you will all be very familiar with the equity piece of investments. You make an investment as an equity, and you get a shareholding, and you have the responsibilities and the privileges of a equity shareholder. And then on the other side of the spectrum, at the other end of the spectrum, you have grants. And we all understand what grants are. These are the philanthropic dollars where there is no expectation for any kind of return at all. Although increasingly we're seeing family offices making repayable grants. That's a really interesting innovation recently. Because I think what we're beginning to realize is we want to make the people responsible, with the money that they're receiving. When it's free, sometimes you don't have the same responsibility. And so we are seeing people are now making these repayable grants. Effectively, there's zero interest loans, right, that can be written off if needs be. And then in between, you have what we use a lot of, the convertible loan notes. The advantage of the convertible loan notes is that you don't have to agree a valuation. You can always put that out to the future. And so that's great for the entrepreneur. So we use a lot of convertible loan notes in terms of structuring these kinds of investments. And then, of course, there is debt. And usually we do debt as part of an equity deal in a concessionary way. Tier 1 company in Kenya, if you want to borrow, it's 18% per annum interest rate. A Tier 2 company has to borrow at 28% interest rate. It's really tough to grow these kinds of businesses, right? So we need more private equity, private debt at a rate that makes sense for growing businesses. And then another instrument we are using a lot of is what we call repayable royalty-based, revenue-based repayments. Because when you make a loan and it's a fixed amount every month, it's a real challenge for a lot of these growing businesses. Whereas if you charge them what is based on their revenue, so if they could be going cycles, right, in terms of sales. So that really helps these entrepreneurs manage their cash flow. So we're seeing a lot of that kind of instruments being used. And then finally, there's a growing interest in using carbon finance. There's a lot of money out there, and we need to learn how to help our entrepreneurs leverage carbon finance. And I'll have some examples of that. So this was my first investment in South Africa when I became disillusioned with my own philanthropy. I bought 40,000 acres of degraded farmland, fenced 75 kilometers of elephant-proof fencing, then brought in big animals to that part of South Africa for the first time in 150 years, and then built a five-star lodge with a staff village. It took me 2 years to do that. To use it to catalyze transformation in a district that had 85% unemployment. So the question was, if you go into a place like that, what can you really do as a philanthropist? You can build a school, you can build a clinic, you can build an orphanage. Those are all good things that we need to do more of. But it was never going to change anything. It wasn't going to shift the needle. As business people, we need to think about using our gifts and our abilities to think creatively about how we can build enterprises and have the courage to invest in this kind of way. So I was foolish enough to say, let's go and do something in this district. It was the poorest province in the country. Bought the land, bought 21 farms, but I had to use my own money. So this was really putting your money where your mouth is time, right? This was really, and this was the first year of Nelson Mandela stepping down as president. So the first year of Thabo Mbeki, the rand was depreciating by the week, and everyone was predicting civil war. But I felt that this was something I needed to do. It was a calling. So I had put my own money. I knew I couldn't talk to my friends. It was just too crazy. It was in the middle of nowhere. And so it had to be my own money. And we bought up the land. And we did the fencing. And then what I did was I went to the development corporation of that province, the Eastern Cape Development Corporation. I said, look, I've put up my own money. This is a really poor district. how about a concessionary loan? Persuaded them. So there was a concessionary loan from the Development Corporation, and we used that to build a lodge and to build the staff village for about 60 people. And then I went to the National Parks Board. I said, look, I can't afford to buy all the animals. It's just too expensive, 30 elephants, rhinos, lions, I can't. How about we pay you a royalty based on revenue, right? Until we are ready, and then we'll buy it from you. So that was how we structured this really complicated kind of investment. So it was a partnership, it was collaborative. I can't do it on my own. So it was with the National Parks Board, who were willing. They wanted to see animals there. And then about 5 years ago now, we had enough revenue and we bought all the animals off them, right? But these are the kinds of deals that we had to do to sort of get to where we've got to today. So today we own all the animals, and we run a number of conservation programs for these endangered species. But the real reason we are there is because of the poverty that was there. And all our people now live in what we call standard housing, which is concrete floors, concrete walls, indoor bathroom, flush toilet, water, electricity, and solar panels. So over the time of our investment, we want to know how many people start to have standard housing. And these are some of the metrics that we measure: gender, average salary, excluding managers, how much tax we pay to the government, how many start to save money so that they can send their children to tertiary education. So these are some of the metrics that we measure. Here's another one. After we sorted out the animal side, we then said, what are we going to do about the land? We have 15,000 acres of degraded farmland. And we've been learning how to grow this local plant called speckboom for about 8 years to see how quick, what's the best and fastest way to grow them. But then, having done that, how are we going to finance this big project? How are we going to plant 15,000 acres? That's where carbon financing came in. So we were able to do the science to know how much per acre captures the carbon. We were then able to go onto the market and pre-sell the whole project to some institutions, primarily on the compliance market. Some of you will know there is a voluntary market, which is very low price. Then there is a compliance market. Voluntary market, you may get $2 to $5 per ton of carbon. Compliance market, you can get anywhere from $25 to $35 per ton. Big difference. So selling this on the compliance market and learning how to do that has been really an important part of our learning over the last 6 years or so. And we were able basically to sell this for about $17 million to $20 million. So it's leveraging the carbon finance which is out there. And I think there are lots of opportunities for carbon financing here in Guatemala. And we need to get smart about how to do that. So then we planted 30 million cuttings. So this is what a nursery of 30 million cuttings looks like. And that employed about 350 people over a 2-year period. Here's another financing that we did on low-cost schools. So this was, I think, my third or fourth investment when I started on this journey 25 years ago. How do you address the problem of education in the slums? And the traditional way has been to build these charity schools and so on. We've gone in to say, let's design an enterprise solution. Started with one school. With the budget for each school was about $40,000. So a very simple building with corrugated iron, no walls really. It's a very low wall. By the way, this was what my first school in rural Malaysia looked like. And when it rained, we all had a free shower. And it showed to me that, it's not about the external structure. It's about the investment on the inside. It's the software that's important. It's not the hardware on the outside. So anyway, we have all the curriculum on tablets. Parents pay us $5 per child per month by mobile money, and we pay staff and suppliers by mobile money. And that, because we use mobile money, we cut down on the cost of the back office. So what started as one school in the biggest slum in Africa, in Kibera slum, in 2009, today we have 10,000 schools with 3 million kids in schools, all right, at scale. You've got to give them enough capital. So there have been several funding rounds. And initially, there was a mix of private equity. We put in private equity, but then others put in some family offices put in philanthropic dollars just to pilot the curriculum. This is all new, so it's very high risk. So the family offices were fantastic. They came in and provided grants to do different versions because there's so many subjects. And then we wanted to experiment. How do you teach? What's the best way to teach English to children whose first language is Swahili? Right? So once we got to, I think, about 200 schools, we were able to trial different types of models. One school will try one method, another school will try another method, and so on. And we had an educational team based in Boston who did the analytics. And then we can then say, this is the best way to teach English to Swahili-speaking families. So the family office, the philanthropic dollars were really important in helping us to iterate. But at the end of the day, this has to be a profit-based enterprise. Agape is another interesting story in terms of the financing. So this was the founder had been in jail in Singapore for 8 years. And he had this crazy idea of wanting to go back into the prison to build a telephone call center. If you know Singapore at all, Singapore is a very unforgiving society. It's a society of one chance. If you blow that one chance, that's it. You're an outcast. So nobody would fund him. It's just too crazy. Would you give money to someone who's been in jail for 8 years? Not easily. It took us, I think, easily 6 months to get to know him, to get to know his wife, to get to know his family, before we began to think, yeah, maybe we can invest in this guy. Because inside the prison, you can't give people phone numbers and bank account details, right? For the call center, everything has to be electronic. And therefore, it was a big investment in computers. And it's therefore the only room in the whole prison that is air-conditioned. And because of that, everybody wants to work in this call center, right? It's the coolest place in the whole prison. But it was still $500,000 US. That's a big chunk to give to the CEO, who is an ex-con. CFO is an ex-con. The head of training is an ex-con. The whole bunch of ex-prisoners. Time, character. Those are the issues that we actually look at again and again before we make an investment decision. Yes, we wanted to tackle this problem, but it needed to be an entrepreneur with the right kind of character. Because if you don't get the character piece right, nothing else works. You can throw as much money as you like, but if the character of the entrepreneur isn't right, we're not going to be successful. So we finally made a brave decision to make this investment, but we actually put in a number of constraints. We would sit on a board. We would agree a strategy. We would agree some milestones. And it's been up and down. But finally today, after the prisoners have been, and we pay the prisoners in prison for work. After they come out from jail, we rehire them in the call center in the city. And today we employ over 250 people. It's profitable. It pays a dividend to us as shareholders. And now the Indonesian government has asked them now, they're going to replicate this in 6 prisons. And we're just about to take them into Malaysia to work with refugees who have no rights in Malaysia. We can use technology like this to give them work. So this was quite an interesting journey of financing. How do we do that? But we had to take that first step. In fact, we had to do several rounds before they were profitable. But once it's profitable, then others have come in. Now the government has come in. Now the government can give them grants, giving them contracts and so on. But we had to be there to prove. Besigo is an interesting business. This is the first ever electric bus company in Nairobi, in Kenya. And I don't need to talk to this audience about the importance of the environment and so on. But what I wanted to share with you about this particular story is twofold in terms of the financing. One, we structure this as a pay-as-you-drive, because we want each driver to own their own buses over a 6 to 7 year period, right? So this is not your traditional kind of structure. This is investing in such a way that you want to enable and empower these drivers to own their own buses, so that they then have an asset. Because the thing is, if you and I go to the bank and you want to borrow money, you know what these bankers are like. They only give you an umbrella when you don't need one, right? When you really need an umbrella, you don't get one when it's raining. So the bank manager will always say, well, have you got a job? So yes, I've got a job. Second thing is, have you got any collateral? Do you have a house? Do you have a motorbike? Right? Because they want all the collaterals. And unless we enable and help the poor to own assets, they will always remain in the informal economy. To really help the poor transform themselves, we need to move them from the informal economy into the formal economy. Because I tell you, it is very expensive living in the informal economy. And an asset helps them to become a part of the formal economy. So it's very intentional. And then the other thing about the structuring is that because we didn't want to get too tied up with all the assets, we've hived it off into a special purpose vehicle with other investors coming in. So we now build these buses now in Kenya to expand. And likewise, Max is a motorbike hailing company in Nigeria. We have over 30,000 motorbike riders. We've just given them another chunk of money to move them into electric bikes. And again, the idea there is that we want them to own their own bikes in a 2-year to 3-year period. Because again, it's about helping the poor to own assets, either physical assets or head assets, right? Knowledge-based assets, because that's what they need to transform their families. Cocoa is another one where we've been able to supply bioethanol at scale to over 1 million families now in Kenya. And we use the petrol companies' station infrastructure to store and distribute the bioethanol. And then they go to these small mom and pop shops that have a kiosk, and people come and use mobile money to buy what they need in terms of bioethanol. And because of that, we know exactly how much bioethanol is used. And because we know exactly how much bioethanol is used, we can then use that to sell carbon credits. And with the carbon, we can then subsidize the cost of the fuel to the poor. Right? So it's been creative in terms of how we leverage every part that we can to sort of make it as affordable as possible for the poor. Synergy is a chain of toilets that we have in Kenya, in one of the largest slums there. And we invested originally to try and solve this big problem of toilets, sanitation in the slums. So we franchise it to largely women who then charge people per use. Today we have over 5,000 of these toilets. We serve about 270,000 people on a daily basis. But doing it that way just doesn't make any money at all. So we had some family officers who were very kind, gave us some money very early on to start experimenting with processing the waste. We take the waste away to process into organic fertilizer as well as black soldier fly protein. So early days, lots of experimentation, very high risk, and this is where the philanthropic grants were really, really helpful. So today, we have this big factory where these flies, we grow these flies, they lay their eggs on poo, and as they munch on the poo, they make their own poo, and their own poo is fertilizer. And then as the larvae grows to a size, when it's full size, we harvest the larvae, and we use that to feed chickens. We use that in fish meal. We use that in animal feed. So it's a real circular economy, right? So there is money in poo. There is money in waste. These flies will feed on waste as well. And that factory was built really with grant money from the IFC, the International Financial Corporation. They liked the idea. They were willing to sort of invest to build this, which is now one of the largest black soldier fly insect protein factory in Africa. There's a couple more. Some of you will know the name Jane Goodall, who was the expert on chimpanzees, the primatologist. This was Jane Goodall's second field station, Budungo. It's an 800 square kilometer forest, home to 600 chimpanzees. Sadly, Jane died last week at the age of 91. So I'm very sad because we invited her to come for an opening when we open later this year or early next year. So unfortunately, she wasn't there. But this was a problem that we're trying to address. So satellite imaging showing in the red all the degradation of the 600 square kilometer forest. And if you add the red to the yellow bits in the middle, almost 50% of this forest is degraded. These chimpanzees need vast areas because they build a new nest every night. Every night. Once the forest goes, the chimpanzees go. And the reason for the deforestation is because of the poverty in the community. People chop trees to sell charcoal so that they can feed their families. And you can't judge them. You can't stop them. This is their right? Unless we provide alternatives. So the strategy to solving the environmental problem is not to do it in silos, but to look at a more holistic view of where the problem lies. And the problem is not with the environment. The problem is with the human. We are the problem. And if you don't solve the human problem, I don't believe we can solve the environmental problem. So the whole idea now is to go in to this poor community and build 4 or 5 businesses that can start to create livelihoods, pay real salaries, provide pensions for the people in the community, and see over a period of time whether we can see some transformation. Belmont University very kindly did a social economic survey of the community. Average income per family per year is $300. And each family, on average, is 6 members of the family. So this is way below $1 per child per month. So that's where we're at. And so we're building 4 or 5 businesses in there, one of which is a luxury lodge which we hope to open December this year or January next year. And then we're building 4 other factories in there, one of which is a dried fruit factory, dried pineapples, dried mangoes. A lot of these fruit just go to waste, and there's a growing interest in healthy snacks, and these dried fruit can then be used in yogurts and ice creams and so on. So those, and the way we're structuring these enterprises is we're inviting these businesses that are already established elsewhere in other countries to come as a partner. We provide the capital, we provide the land, and we give them a majority stake in the business. They run it because we want them to come with their expertise to come run it. So that's the structure with all these businesses. So those are some of the things that we've done, and hopefully give you an idea about the kinds of financing structures that we've utilized.